Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Annius Verus was born in Rome in 121. The Annii had come a century before from Succubo near Cordova. There, it seems, their honesty had won them the cognomen Verus, true. 3 months after the boy's birth, his father died, and he was taken into the home of his rich grandfather, then consul. Hadrian was a frequent visitor there. He took a fancy to the boy and saw in him the stuff of kings. Seldom has any lad had so propitious a youth, or so keenly appreciated his good fortune. "To the gods," he wrote 50 years later, "I am indebted for having good grandparents, good parents, a good sister, good teachers, good kinsmen and friends, nearly everything good." Time struck a balance by giving him a questionable wife and a worthless son. His Meditations lists the virtues these people had and the lessons he received from them in modesty, patience, manliness, abstemiousness, piety, benevolence, and a simplicity of life far removed from the habits of the rich, though wealth surrounded him on every side. Never was a boy so persistently educated. He was attached in boyhood to the service of temples and priests. He committed to memory every word of the ancient and unintelligible liturgy, and though philosophy later shook his faith, it never diminished his sedulous performance of the old exacting ritual. Marcus liked games and sports, even bird snaring and hunting, and some efforts were made to train his body as well as his mind and character. But 17 tutors in childhood are a heavy handicap. 4 grammarians, 4 rhetors, 1 jurist, and 8 philosophers divided his soul among them. The most famous of these teachers was M. Cornelius Fronto, who taught him rhetoric. Though Marcus loved him, lavished upon him all the kindnesses of an affectionate and royal pupil, and exchanged with him letters of intimate charm, the youth turned his back upon oratory as a vain and dishonest art, and abandoned himself to philosophy. He thanks his instructors for sparing him logic and astrology, thanks Diognetus the Stoic for freeing him from superstition, Junius Rusticus for acquainting him with Epictetus, and Sextus of Chaeronea for teaching him to live in conformity with nature. He is grateful to his brother Severus for telling him about Brutus, Cato of Utica, Thracia, and Helvidius. From him I received the idea of a state in which there is the same law for all, a polity of equal rights and freedom of speech, and the idea of a kingly government that most of all respects the freedom of the governed. Here the Stoic ideal of monarchy takes possession of the throne. He thanks Maximus for teaching him self-government and not to be led aside by anything, cheerfulness in all circumstances, and a just admixture of gentleness and dignity, and to do appointed tasks without complaining. It is clear that the leading philosophers of the time were priests without religion rather than metaphysicians without life. Marcus took them so seriously that for a time he almost ruined a naturally weak constitution with ascetic devotions. At the age of 12 he took on the rude cloak of a philosopher, slept on a little straw strewn over the floor, and long resisted the entreaties of his mother to use a couch. He was a Stoic before he became a man. He offers thanks that I preserved the flower of my youth, that I took not upon me to be a man before my time, but rather put it off longer than I needed, that I never had to do with Benedicta, and afterwards, when I fell into some fits of love, I was soon cured. 2 influences diverted him from professional philosophy and sanctity. One was the succession of minor political offices to which he was appointed. The realism of an administrator was crossed with the idealism of a meditative youth. The other was his close association with Antoninus Pius. He did not fret at Antoninus's longevity, but continued his life of Stoic simplicity, philosophical study, and official duties, while living in the palace and serving his protracted apprenticeship. And the example of his adoptive father's devotion and honesty in government became a powerful influence in his development. The name by which we know him, Aurelius, was the clan name of Antoninus, which both Marcus and Lucius, on their adoption, had taken as their own. Lucius became a gay man of the world, a graceful adept in the pleasures of life. When, in 146, Pius desired a colleague to share the government with him, he named Marcus only and left to Lucius the empire of love. On the death of Antoninus, Marcus became sole emperor. But remembering Hadrian's wish, he at once made Lucius Verus his full colleague and gave him his daughter Lucilla in marriage. At the outset of his reign, as at the end, the philosopher erred through kindness. The division of rule was a bad precedent which, in the heirs of Diocletian and Constantine, would divide and weaken the realm. Marcus asked the Senate to vote Pius divine honors, completed with perfect taste the temple that Pius had raised to his wife, and rededicated it to Antoninus and Faustina both. Its 10 Corinthian monolithic columns are among the finest remains in the Forum. The portico is intact, and the cella, though shorn of its marble facing, has survived as the Church of San Lorenzo in Miranda. He paid the Senate every courtesy and rejoiced to see that many of his philosopher friends had found their way into its membership. All Italy and all the provinces acclaimed him as Plato's dream come true. The philosopher was king. But he had no thought of attempting a utopia. Like Antoninus, he was a conservative. Radicals do not grow up in palaces. He was a philosopher-king in the Stoic rather than the Platonic sense. Never hope, he admonished himself, to realize Plato's republic. Let it be sufficient that you have in some degree ameliorated mankind, and do not think such improvement a matter of small importance. Who can change the opinions of men? And without a change of sentiments, what can you make but reluctant slaves and hypocrites? He had discovered that not all men wished to be saints, and he sadly reconciled himself to a world of corruption and wickedness. The immortal gods consent for countless ages to endure without anger, and even to surround with blessings so many and such evil men. But thou, who hast so short a time to live, art thou already weary? He decided to rely on example rather than law. He made himself, in fact, a public servant. He carried all the burdens of administration and judgment, even that part which Lucius had agreed to take but was neglecting. He allowed himself no luxury, treated all men with simple fellowship, and wore himself out by being easy of access. He was not a great statesman. He spent too much of the public funds in cash gifts to the people and the army, gave each member of the Praetorian Guard 20,000 sesterces, increased the number of those who could apply for free corn, provided frequent and costly games, and remitted large sums in unpaid taxes and tribute. It was generosity with many precedents, but unwise at a time when rebellion or war visibly threatened or was breaking out in several provinces and on far-spread frontiers. Marcus continued sedulously that reform of law which Hadrian had begun. He increased the number of court days and reduced the length of trials. He himself often sat as judge, inflexible against grave offenses, but usually merciful. He devised legal protection for wards against dishonest guardians, for debtors against creditors, for provinces against governors. He connived at the rejuvenation of the forbidden collegia, legalized those associations which were chiefly burial societies, made them legal persons eligible for bequests, and established a fund for the interment of poor citizens. He gave the alimenta the widest extension in their history. After the death of his wife, he created an endowment for the aid of young women. A pretty bas-relief shows us such girls crowding around the younger Faustina, who pours wheat into their laps. He abolished mixed bathing, forbade extravagant remuneration to actors and gladiators, restricted, according to their wealth, the expenditures of the cities on games, required the use of foiled weapons in gladiatorial contests, and did all that sanguinary custom would allow to banish death from the arena. The people loved him, but not his laws. When he enlisted gladiators in his army for the Marcomannic Wars, the populace cried out in good-humored anger, "He is taking our amusement from us. He wants to force us to be philosophers." Rome was preparing, but not quite ready, to be Puritan. It was his misfortune that his fame as a philosopher and the long peace under Hadrian and Antoninus encouraged rebels within and barbarians without. In 162, revolt broke out in Britain, the Catti invaded Roman Germany, and the Parthian king Vologases III declared war upon Rome. Marcus chose able generals to put down the revolt in the north, but he delegated to Lucius Verus the major task of fighting Parthia. Lucius got no farther than Antioch, for there lived Panthea, so beautiful and accomplished that Lucian thought all the perfections of all sculptural masterpieces had come together in her, to which were added a voice of intoxicating melody, fingers skilled on the lyre, and a mind enriched with literature and philosophy. Lucius saw her and, like Gilgamesh, forgot when he was born. He abandoned himself to pleasure, to hunting, at last to debauchery, while the Parthians rode into terror-stricken Syria. Marcus made no comment on Lucius, but sent to Avidius Cassius, second in charge in Lucius's army, a plan of campaign whose military excellence helped the general's own ability not only to drive the Parthians back across Mesopotamia, but to plant the Roman standards once more in Seleucia and Ctesiphon. This time the two cities were burned to the ground, lest they serve again as bases for Parthian campaigns. Lucius returned from Antioch to Rome and was awarded a triumph, which he magnanimously insisted that Marcus should share. Lucius brought with him the invisible victor of the war, pestilence. It had appeared first among the troops of Avidius in captured Seleucia. It spread so rapidly that he withdrew his army into Mesopotamia, while the Parthians rejoiced at the vengeance of their gods. The retreating legions carried the plague with them to Syria. Lucius took some of these soldiers to Rome to march in his triumph. They infected every city through which they passed and every region of the empire to which they were later assigned. The ancient historians tell us more of its ravages than of its nature. Their descriptions suggest exanthematous typhus or possibly bubonic plague. Galen thought it similar to the disease that had wasted the Athenians under Pericles. In both cases, black pustules almost covered the body. The victim was racked with a hoarse cough, and his breath stank. Rapidly it swept through Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, Italy, and Gaul. Within a year, 166 to 67, it had killed more men than had been lost in the war. In Rome, 2,000 died of it in one day, including many of the aristocracy. Corpses were carried out of the city in heaps. Marcus, helpless before this intangible enemy, did all he could to mitigate the evil, but the medical science of his day could offer him no guidance, and the epidemic ran its course until it had established an immunity or had killed all its carriers. The effects were endless. Many localities were so despoiled of population that they reverted to jungle or desert. Food production fell, transport was disorganized, floods destroyed great quantities of grain, and famine succeeded plague. The happy hilaritas that had marked the beginning of Marcus's reign vanished. Men yielded to a bewildered pessimism, flocked to soothsayers and oracles, clouded the altars with incense and sacrifice, and sought consolation where alone it was offered them, in the new religions of personal immortality and heavenly peace. Amid these domestic difficulties, news came, 167, that the tribes along the Danube, Catti, Quadi, Marcomanni, Yazyges, had crossed the river, overwhelmed a Roman garrison of 20,000 men, and were pouring unhindered into Dacia, Rhaetia, Pannonia, Noricum. That some had made their way over the Alps, had defeated every army sent against them, were besieging Aquileia, near Venice, were threatening Verona, and were laying waste the rich fields of northern Italy. Never before had the German tribes moved with such unity or so closely threatened Rome. Marcus acted with surprising decisiveness. He put away the pleasures of philosophy and determined to take the field in what he foresaw would be the most momentous of Roman wars since Hannibal. He shocked Italy by enrolling policemen, gladiators, slaves, brigands, and barbarous mercenaries into legions depleted by war and pestilence. Even the gods were conscripted to his purpose. He bade the priests of alien faiths to offer sacrifice for Rome according to their various rites. And he himself burned such hecatombs at the altars that a wit circulated a message sent him by white oxen, begging him not to be too victorious. "If thou shouldst conquer, we are lost." To raise war funds without levying special taxes, he auctioned off in the Forum the wardrobes, art objects, and jewels of the imperial palaces. He took careful measures of defense, fortified the border towns from Gaul to the Aegean, blocked the passes into Italy, and bribed German and Scythian tribes to attack the invaders in the rear. With energy and courage all the more admirable in a man who hated war, he trained his army into disciplined strength, led them through a hard campaign mapped out with strategic skill, drove the besiegers from Aquileia, and routed them even to the Danube, until nearly all were captured or dead. He understood that this action had not ended the German danger, but thinking the situation safe for a time, he returned with his colleague to Rome. On the way, Lucius died of an apoplectic stroke, and gossip, which, like politics, has no bowels of mercy, whispered that Marcus had poisoned him. From January to September 169, the emperor rested at home from efforts that had strained his frail body close to the breaking point. He suffered from a stomach ailment that often left him too weak to talk. He controlled it by eating sparingly, one light meal a day. Those who knew his condition and his diet marveled at his labors in the palace and the field, and could only say that he made up in resolution what he lacked in strength. On several occasions he called in the most famous physician of the age, Galen of Pergamum, and praised him for the unpretentious remedies he prescribed. Perhaps a succession of domestic disappointments cooperated with political and military crises to aggravate his illness and make him old at 48. His wife, Faustina, whose pretty face has come down to us in many a sculptured portrait, may not have relished sharing bed and board with incarnate philosophy. She was a lively creature who longed for a gayer life than his sober nature could give her. The talk of the town assumed her infidelity. The mimes satirized him as a cuckold, and even named his rivals. Like Antoninus with Faustina the mother, Marcus said nothing. Instead, he promoted the supposed paramours to high office, gave Faustina every sign of tenderness and respect, had her deified when she died, 175, and thanked the gods in his meditations for so obedient and affectionate a wife. No evidence exists upon which to condemn her. Of the 4 children that she gave him, and whom he loved with a passion still warm in his letters to Fronto, 1 girl died in childhood. The surviving daughter was saddened by Lucius's life and widowed by his death. Twin sons came in 161. One died at birth, the other was Commodus. Scandalmongers called him a gladiator's gift to Faustina, and he strove all his life long to confirm the tale. But he was a handsome and vigorous lad. Marcus forgivably doted on him, presented him to the legions in a manner symbolic of naming a successor, and engaged the best teachers in Rome to fit him for rule. The youth preferred to model cups, dance, sing, hunt, and fence. He developed an understandable aversion to books, scholars, and philosophers, but enjoyed the company of gladiators and athletes. Soon he surpassed all comrades in lying, cruelty, and coarse speech. Marcus was too good to be great enough to discipline him or renounce him. He kept on hoping that education and responsibility would sober him and make him grow into a king. The lonely emperor, emaciated, beard untended, eyes weary with anxiety and sleeplessness, turned back from his wife and son to the tasks of government and war. The assaults of the Central European tribes against the frontier had stopped only for a breathing spell. In this struggle to destroy an empire and make barbarism free, peace was but an armistice. In 169, the Catti invaded the Roman regions of the Upper Rhine. In 170, the Colsi attacked Belgica, and another force besieged Sarmizegetusa. The Costoboii crossed the Balkans into Greece and plundered the Temple of the Mysteries at Eleusis, 14 miles from Athens. The Morai, or Moors, invaded Spain from Africa, and a new tribe, the Longobardi, or Lombards, made its first appearance on the Rhine. Despite 100 defeats, the fertile barbarians were growing stronger, the barren Romans weaker. Marcus saw that it was now a war to the death, that one side must destroy the other or go under. Only a man schooled in the Roman and Stoic sense of duty could have transformed himself so completely from a mystic philosopher into a competent and successful general. The philosopher remained, hidden under the imperator's armor. In the very tumult of this Second Marcomannic War, 169–75, in his camp facing the Quaedi on the river Grana, probably the Gran, a tributary of the Danube, Marcus wrote that little book of meditations by which the world chiefly remembers him. This glimpse of a frail and fallible saint pondering the problems of morality and destiny while leading a great army in a conflict on which the fate of the empire turned is one of the most intimate pictures that time has preserved of its great men. Pursuing the Sarmatians by day, he could write with sympathy of them at night. A spider, when it has caught a fly, thinks it has done a great deed. So does one who has run down a hare, or who has captured Sarmatians. Are they not all alike robbers? Nevertheless, he fought the Sarmatians, the Marcomanni, the Quaedi, the Yazyges, through 6 hard years, defeated them, and marched his legions as far north as Bohemia. It was apparently his plan to use the Hercynian and Carpathian ranges as a new frontier. If he had succeeded, Roman civilization might have made Germany, like Gaul, Latin in speech and classical in heritage. But at the height of his successes, he was shocked to learn that Avidius Cassius, after putting down a revolt in Egypt, had declared himself emperor. Marcus surprised the barbarians with a hasty peace, merely annexing a 10-mile strip on the north bank of the Danube and leaving strong garrisons on the southern side. He summoned his soldiers, told them that he would gladly yield his place to Avidius if Rome wished it, promised to pardon the rebel, and marched into Asia to encounter him. Meanwhile, a centurion killed Cassius, and the rebellion collapsed. Marcus passed through Asia Minor and Syria to Alexandria, mourning like Caesar that he had been cheated of a chance for clemency. At Smyrna, Alexandria, and Athens, he walked the streets without a guard, wore the mantle of a philosopher, attended the lectures of the leading teachers, and joined with them in discussion, speaking Greek. During his stay at Athens, he endowed professorships in each of the great schools of doctrine, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean. In the fall of 76, after almost 7 years of war, Aurelius reached Rome and was accorded a triumph as the savior of the empire. The emperor associated Commodus with himself in victory, and now made him, a lad of 15, his colleague on the throne. For the first time in nearly a century, the principle of adoption was put aside, and the hereditary principate was resumed. Marcus knew what perils he was inviting for the empire. He chose them as a lesser evil than the civil war that Commodus and his friends would wage if he were denied the throne. We must not judge him with hindsight. Neither did Rome anticipate the consequences of this love. There the plague had burned itself out, and men were beginning to be happy again. The capital had suffered little from the wars, which had been financed with remarkable economy and little extra taxation. While battle raged on the frontiers, trade flourished within, and money jingled everywhere. It was the height of Rome's tide and of its emperor's popularity. All the world acclaimed him as at once a soldier, a sage, and a saint. But his triumph did not deceive him. He knew that the problem of Germany had not been solved. Convinced that further invasions could be prevented only by an active policy of extending the frontier to the mountains of Bohemia, he set forth with Commodus in 178 on the Third Marcomannic War. Crossing the Danube, he again defeated the Quaedi after a long and arduous campaign. No resistance remained, and he was about to annex the lands of the Quaedi, the Marcomanni, and the Sarmatians, roughly Bohemia and Danubian Galicia, as new provinces, when sickness struck him down in his camp at Vindobona, Vienna. Feeling death's hand, he called Commodus to his side and warned him to carry through the policy which was now so near fulfillment, and realize the dream of Augustus by pushing the boundary of the empire to the Elbe. We must not merely acknowledge the resolution and tenacity of the ruler, says the impartial Mommsen, but must also admit that he did what right policy enjoined. Then he refused all further food or drink. On the 6th day he rose with his last strength and presented Commodus to the army as the new emperor. Returning to his couch, he covered his head with the sheet and soon afterward died. When his body reached Rome, the people had already begun to worship him as a god who, for a while, had consented to live on the earth. The emperor as philosopher. 6 years before his death, Marcus Aurelius sat down in his tent to formulate his thoughts on human life and destiny. We cannot be sure that the ta eis heauton, to himself, was intended for the public eye. Probably so, for even saints are vain, and the greatest man of action has moments of weakness in which he aspires to write a book. Marcus was not an expert author. Most of the training that Fronto had given him in Latin was wasted now, since he wrote in Greek. Besides, these golden thoughts were penned in the intervals of travel, battles, revolts, and many tribulations. We must forgive them for being disconnected and formless, often repetitious, sometimes dull. The book is precious only for its contents, its tenderness and candor, its half-conscious revelations of a pagan, Christian, ancient, medieval soul. Like most thinkers of his time, Aurelius conceived philosophy not as a speculative description of infinity, but as a school of virtue and a way of life. He hardly bothers to make up his mind about God. Sometimes he talks like an agnostic, acknowledging that he does not know, but having made that admission, he accepts the traditional faith with a simple piety. Of what worth is it to me, he asks, to live in a universe without gods or providence? He speaks of deity now in the singular, now in the plural, with all the indifference of Genesis. He offers public prayer and sacrifice to the old divinities, but in his private thought he is a pantheist, deeply impressed with the order of the cosmos and the wisdom of God. He has a Hindu's sense of the interdependence of the world and man. He marvels at the growth of the child out of a little seed, the miraculous formation of organs, strength, mind, and aspiration out of a little food. He believes that if we could understand, we should find in the universe the same order and creative power as in man. All things are implicated with one another, and the bond is holy. There is a common reason in all intelligent beings. One God pervades all things, one substance, one law, one truth. Can a clear order subsist in thee, and disorder in the all? He admits the difficulty of reconciling evil, suffering, apparently unmerited misfortune, with a good providence, but we cannot judge the place of any element or event in the scheme of things unless we see the whole. And who shall pretend to such total perspective? It is therefore insolent and ridiculous for us to judge the world. Wisdom lies in recognizing our limitations, in seeking to be harmonious parts of the universal order, in trying to sense the mind behind the body of the world and cooperating with it willingly. To one who has reached this view, everything that happens justly, i.e., as in the course of nature. Nothing that is according to nature can be evil. Everything natural is beautiful to him who understands. All things are determined by the universal reason, the inherent logic of the whole, and every part must welcome cheerfully its modest role and fate. Equanimity, the watchword of the dying Antoninus, is the voluntary acceptance of the things that are assigned to thee by the nature of the whole. Everything harmonizes with me that harmonizes with thee, O universe. Nothing for me is too early or too late which is in due time for thee. Everything is fruit to me that thy seasons bring, O nature. From thee are all things, in thee are all things, to thee all things return. Knowledge is of value only as a tool of the good life. What then can direct a man? One thing only, philosophy. Not as logic or learning, but as a persistent training in moral excellence. Be thou erect or be made erect. God has given every man a guiding daimon or inner spirit, his reason. Virtue is the life of reason. These are the principles of the rational soul. It traverses the whole universe and surveys its form and extends itself into the infinity of time and embraces the cyclical renewal of all things, and comprehends that those who come after us will see nothing new, nor have those before us seen anything more. But in a manner he who is 40 years old, if he has any understanding at all, has seen, by virtue of this uniformity, all things that have been or will be. Marcus thinks his premises compel him to Puritanism. Pleasure is neither good nor useful. He renounces the flesh and all its works, and talks at times like some Anthony in the Thebaid. Observe how ephemeral and worthless human things are, and what was yesterday a little mucus, tomorrow will be a mummy or ashes. The whole space of a man's life is but little, and yet with what troubles it is filled, and with what a wretched body it must be passed. Turn it inside out, and see what kind of thing it is. The mind must be a citadel free from bodily desires, passions, anger, or hate. It must be so absorbed in its work as hardly to notice the adversities of fortune or the barbs of enmity. Every man is worth just so much as the things about which he busies himself. He reluctantly concedes that there are bad men in this world. The way to deal with them is to remember that they too are men, the helpless victims of their own faults by the determinism of circumstance. If any man has done thee wrong, the harm is his own. It is thy duty to forgive him. If the existence of evil men saddens you, think of the many fine persons you have met and the many virtues that are mingled in imperfect characters. Good or bad, all men are brothers, kinsmen in one God. Even the ugliest barbarian is a citizen of the fatherland to which we all belong. As Aurelius, I have Rome for my country, as a man, the world. Does this seem an impracticable philosophy? On the contrary, nothing is so invincible as a good disposition, if it be sincere. A really good man is immune to misfortune, for whatever evil befalls him leaves him still his own soul. Will this evil that has happened prevent thee from being just, magnanimous, temperate, prudent, modest, free? Suppose that men curse thee, kill thee, cut thee in pieces. What can these things do to prevent thy mind from remaining pure, wise, sober, and just? If a man stand by a limpid, pure spring and curse it, the spring never ceases to send up clean water. If he cast dirt into it or filth, it will speedily wash them out and be unpolluted again. On every occasion that brings thee trouble, remember to apply this principle, that this is not a misfortune, but that to bear it nobly is good fortune. Thou seest how few the things are to which, if a man lays hold of, he is able to live a life that flows on quietly and is like the existence of the gods. Marcus's life, however, did not flow on quietly. He had to kill Germans while writing this fifth gospel, and in the end he faced death with no consolation in the son who would succeed him, and no hope of happiness beyond the grave. Soul and body alike returned to their original elements. For as the mutation and dissolution of bodies make room for other bodies doomed to die, so the souls that are removed into the air after life's existence are transmuted and diffused into the seminal intelligence of the universe, and make room for new souls. Thou hast existed as a part. Thou shalt disappear in that which produced thee. This, too, nature wills. Pass, then, through this little space of time conformably to nature, and end thy journeys in content, just as an olive falls when it is ripe, blessing the nature that produced it, and thanking the tree on which it grew. 6. Commodus. When the officer of the guard asked the dying Marcus for the watchword of the day, he answered, "Go to the rising sun. My sun is setting." The rising sun was then 19, a robust and dashing youth without inhibitions, morals, or fear. One would have expected of him, rather than of Marcus the ailing saint, a policy of war to victory or death. Instead, he offered the enemy immediate peace. They were to withdraw from the vicinity of the Danube, to surrender most of their arms, return all Roman prisoners and deserters, pay Rome an annual tribute of corn, and persuade 13,000 of their soldiers to enlist in the Roman legions. All Rome condemned him except the people. His generals fumed at allowing the trapped prey to escape and fight again another day. During the reign of Commodus, however, no trouble came from the Danubian tribes. The young prince, though no coward, had seen enough of war. He needed peace to enjoy Rome. Back in the capital, he snubbed the Senate and loaded the plebs with unprecedented gifts, 725 denarii to each citizen. Finding no field in politics for his exuberant strength, he hunted beasts on the imperial estates and developed such skill with sword and bow that he decided to perform publicly. For a time he left the palace and lived in the gladiators' school. He drove chariots in the races and fought in the arena against animals and men. Presumably the men who opposed him took care to let him win, but he thought nothing of fighting unaided and before breakfast a hippopotamus, an elephant, and a tiger, which made no distinctions for royalty. He was so perfect a bowman that with 100 arrows he killed 100 tigers in one exhibition. He would let a panther leap upon some condemned criminal and then slay the animal with one arrow, leaving the man unhurt to die again. He had his exploits recorded in the Acta Diurna, and insisted on being paid out of the treasury for each of his 1,000 combats as a gladiator. The historians upon whom we must here depend wrote, like Tacitus, from the viewpoint and traditions of the offended aristocracy. We cannot tell how much of the marvels they relate are history, how much are revenge. We are assured that Commodus drank and gambled, wasted the public funds, kept a harem of 300 women and 300 boys, and liked to vary his sex occasionally, at least by using a woman's garb, even at the public games. Tales of unbelievable cruelty are transmitted to us. Commodus ordered a votary of Bologna to amputate an arm in proof of piety, forced some women devotees of Isis to beat their breasts with pine cones till they died, killed men indiscriminately with his club of Hercules, gathered cripples together and slew them one by one with arrows. One of his mistresses, Marcia, was apparently a Christian. For her sake, we are told, he pardoned some Christians who had been condemned to the Sardinian mines. Her devotion to him suggests that in this man, described as more bestial than any beast, there was some lovable element unrecorded by history. Like his predecessors, he was aroused to the wildest ferocity by fear of assassination. His aunt Lucilla formed a conspiracy to kill him. He discovered it, had her executed, and on proof or suspicion of participation, put so many men of rank to death that soon hardly any survived who had been prominent in Marcus's reign. Delators, who had almost disappeared for a century, returned to activity and favor, and a new terror raged in Rome. Appointing Perennis as Praetorian prefect, Commodus yielded the reins of government to him and, the tradition says, abandoned himself to sexual dissipation. Perennis ruled efficiently but mercilessly. He organized his own terror and had all his opponents slain. The emperor, suspecting that Perennis planned to replace him, surrendered this second Sejanus to the Senate, which reenacted its role of glowing revenge. Cleander, a former slave, succeeded Perennis, 185, and surpassed him in corruption and cruelty. Any office might be had for a proper bribe. Any decision of any court could be reversed. Under his orders, senators and knights were put to death for treason or criticism. In 190, a mob besieged the villa where Commodus was staying and demanded Cleander's death. The emperor accommodated them. Cleander's successor, Letus, after holding power for 3 years, judged that his time had come. One day he chanced upon a proscription list that contained the names of his supporters and friends and of Marcia. On the last day of 192, Marcia gave Commodus a cup of poison, and when it worked too slowly, the athlete whom he had kept to wrestle with strangled him in his bath. He was a youth of 31. When Marcus died, Rome had reached the apex of her curve and was already touched with decay. Her boundaries had been extended beyond the Danube, into Scotland and the Sahara, into the Caucasus and Russia, and to the gates of Parthia. She had accomplished for that confusion of peoples and faiths a unity not of language and culture, but at least of economy and law. She had woven it into a majestic commonwealth, within which the exchange of goods moved in unprecedented plenty and freedom. And for 2 centuries she had guarded the great realm from barbarian inroads and had given it security and peace. All the white man's world looked to her as the center of the universe, the omnipotent and eternal city. Never had there been such wealth, such splendor, or such power. Nevertheless, amid the prosperity that made Rome brilliant in this 2nd century, all the seeds were germinating of the crisis that would ruin Italy in the 3rd. Marcus had contributed heavily to the debacle by naming Commodus his heir, and by wars that centralized ever more authority in the hands of the emperor. Commodus kept in peace the prerogatives assumed by Aurelius in war. Private and local independence, initiative, and pride withered as the power and functions of the state increased, and the wealth of nations was drained away by ever-rising taxation to support a self-multiplying bureaucracy and the endless offensives of defense. The mineral wealth of Italy was diminishing, pestilence and famine had taken bitter toll, the system of tillage by slaves was failing, governmental expenditures and doles had exhausted the treasury and debased the currency. Italian industry was losing its markets in the provinces through provincial competition, and no economic statesman appeared to make up for a languishing foreign trade by a wider distribution of buying power at home. Meanwhile, the provinces had recovered from the exactions of Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Cassius, Brutus, and Antony. Their ancient skills had revived, their industries were flourishing, their new wealth was financing science, philosophy, and art. Their sons replenished the legions, their generals led them. Soon their armies would hold Italy at their mercy and make their generals emperors. The process of conquest was finished and was to be reversed. Henceforth, the conquered would absorb the conquerors. As if conscious of these omens and problems, the mind of Rome at the close of the Antonine Age sank into a cultural and spiritual fatigue. The practical disfranchisement of first the assemblies and then the Senate had removed the mental stimulus that comes from free political activity and a widespread sense of liberty and power. Since the prince had almost all authority, the citizens left him almost all responsibility. More and more of them, even in the aristocracy, retired into their families and their private affairs. Citizens became atoms, and society began to fall to pieces internally precisely when unity seemed most complete. Disillusionment with democracy was followed by disillusionment with monarchy. The golden thoughts of Aurelius were often leaden thoughts, weighted down with the suspicion that Rome's problems could not be solved, that the multiplying barbarians could not long be held back by a sterile and pacific breed. Stoicism, which had begun by preaching strength, was ending by preaching resignation. Almost all the philosophers had made their peace with religion. For 400 years, Stoicism had been to the upper classes a substitute for religion. Now the substitute was put aside, and the ruling orders turned back from the books of the philosophers to the altars of the gods. And yet paganism, too, was dying. Like Italy, it was flushed only with governmental aid and was nearing exhaustion. It had conquered philosophy, but already its temple precincts heard reverently the names of invading deities. The age was heavy with the resurrection of the provinces and the incredible victory of Christ.